Imagine waking up one day and realizing that everything you built could turn to dust in the hands of someone you love. That was exactly how Baba Ao awoke on that silent dawn, carrying in his chest an anguish greater than any wealth could ever heal. The most respected man in the village, owner of vast lands and a generous heart, had only one torment: his son Ikin, a young man with hands full of gold but a soul empty of purpose. In a decision that would shake the entire village, Baba Ao decided to leave everything behind: fortune, comfort, and pride, to teach his son something that no money could buy. But would Ikenna learn this lesson before it was too late? How far can a father go to save his own son from himself? On that silent dawn, while the father disappeared down the dusty road carrying only hope, his son slept deeply, unaware that when he awoke, his world would be on the verge of collapse. The next morning, the mansion looked like an abandoned temple. The sun filtered through the heavy curtains, touching the expensive furniture as if revealing an ancient crime. Ikenna woke up late, still with the bitter taste of wine in his mouth, certain it would be just another day of ordering people around, spending laughing loudly with friends who would vanish at the first sign of trouble. He stretched lazily, expecting to hear the creak of servants opening the door, the smell of strong coffee coming from the kitchen, the sound of disciplined footsteps in the halls. But everything was silent. The silence was so dense it seemed to cling to his skin. Ikenna got up, still confident, and shouted the names of the gardener, the cook, the driver. No answer. He opened doors, finding only empty halls, wilted flowers in vases, dust beginning to settle on the red carpets. The smell of abandonment rose in the air like a broken spell. He ran to the kitchen and found only cold pots, dry crumbs in the corner of the table. That was when the first stab of fear gripped his chest. Still not understanding, he ran to his father's office safe. He typed the code with trembling hands. Nothing. The safe was empty, except for a yellowed envelope with his name, handwritten on it. Baba Ao's firm handwriting trembled in those lines, like a sigh trapped on paper. He tore the letter open in fury, his eyes burning. Son, an inheritance without roots is just wind. Learn to walk before you inherit. I didn't leave you wealth, but I left you a path. When you learn the value of a home, we will meet again. The words danced in his mind like a hammer striking hot iron. He tried to access the bank accounts on his phone, but each click was a knife blow. Blocked, blocked, blocked. Within hours, the news spread like wildfire. The village women, sitting on stools, whispered with wide eyes, "The spoiled boy is penniless now. Now he'll have to live like us, eat dry cassava flour and count coins. Let's see if he can really stand on his own feet." The party friends evaporated like morning mist. No one came to ask if he needed help. No one knocked on the door with a bowl of porridge or a mat to sleep on. It was the first day Ikenna tasted the pure flavor of loneliness. The house, once alive, with laughter and loud music, turned into a tomb of echoes. He ran through the dirt streets, his sandals pounding hard on the ground. He called for his father in every alley, questioned the neighbors, barged into backyards like a lost dog. Where is my father? He can't do this to me," he screamed, but only received looks of pity or contempt. When he fell to his knees at the main gate, sweat mixed with tears. The pride that always inflated his chest now weighed like a chain. Some young men passed by and laughed. "Look at the prince without a crown, gonna beg for rice now." And each laugh was like a slow-cutting knife. Ikenna went back inside, sat on the huge sofa, stared at the walls decorated with travel photos, memories from a world where everything could be bought. Each picture seemed to mock him, his smiling face next to luxury cars, the champagne glass in his hands, the exotic beaches where he never had to share a piece of bread. Hunger came like an unwelcome visitor. There was no one to prepare even the simplest cornmeal mush. He opened cabinets, found empty packages, spices kept like useless treasures. For the first time, he felt his stomach truly growl. It wasn't that hunger you fix with a feast at the push of a button. It was an old, deep hunger that hollowed out the soul. He tried to cook rice, but burned everything. Tried to fry eggs, broke them all on the floor. The acrid smell of burnt food filled the house, like a sign of defeat. By nightfall, Ikenna was sitting on the cold kitchen floor, hugging his knees, his head drooping. The grand mansion now felt like a dark pit. In his mind, one sentence hammered like a funeral chant: "An inheritance without roots is just wind." Through the night, he heard the villagers' voices outside, echoing like distant thunder. Who is born without skin can't stand the strong sun. Money disappears, but shame remains. He wanted to cover his ears, but each word seeped in like poison. For the first time, Ikena felt the weight of not having a lap to rest his head on, of not having a gentle voice saying it will pass. His father had always been there, even from afar, holding the invisible threads of his life. Now, without that protective shadow, he was just a grown boy, naked before the world. That dawn, as the rooster crowed in the distance, Ikena realized that the worst punishment wasn't losing the money, but facing the mirror and seeing a stranger reflected there. This was the beginning of a journey he had never dreamed of taking. His wounded pride hurt more than the hunger, more than the cold. And there, in that cutting silence, Ikena began to feel a kind of pain that no luxury could ever buy. The pain of realizing he had been rich in everything, except in soul. When day broke, Ikena didn't hear birds singing on the veranda, nor the smell of strong coffee wafting up the stairs. He only heard his own breath, short and shaky, like the weak flicker of a nearly extinguished lamp. The sun, which used to kiss the windows in celebration, now invaded the hall like an inspector, exposing every sign of abandonment, every wilted flower in the crystal vase, every grain of dust on the carpets that once felt expensive slippers. Disoriented, Ikena left, wearing the same clothes from the day before, his hair still stuck to his sweaty forehead, his eyes heavy and red from crying and sleeplessness. There was no driver waiting at the gate, no friends honking with loud cars. There was only a rusty gate and a silence that seemed to mock him. On the main street, the markets were set up. Women laid out colorful fabrics, men shouted offers of fresh cassava, and the smell of hot oil mixed with the dust raised by hurried flip-flops. To Ikena, it all felt like a foreign world, where the laughter didn't belong to him, and the faces owed him no reverence. He walked hesitantly, avoiding eye contact to escape the silent judgment in every neighbor's face. In the middle of the square, an old woman with a blue scarf on her head pointed at him. There goes Baba Ao's son. The boy who thought money was eternal. The other women murmured. The men simply watched, shaking their heads silently. This was the worst kind of exposure. No cameras, no newspapers. It was the gaze of the people, heavy as stone, tearing apart his heir's pride. Ikena tried to go to the bank, but the manager, a soft-voiced man who used to serve him imported coffee, now only repeated, "The accounts have been suspended, sir. There's nothing I can do." The young man stumbled out, his heart pounding in his ears like a war drum. Desperate, he decided to look for his father in the smaller village. On the way, he passed dusty trails, climbed slopes he had never even noticed before. His legs ached at every step, his feet swollen, wounded by small stones and thorns that clung to his skin like curses. At every corner, he asked, "Have you seen my father, Mr. Baba Ao, the man with the large lands?" But no one knew or wanted to answer. Some shook their heads, others simply turned away, afraid of carrying a burden that wasn't theirs. When night fell, the sky darkened as quickly as a lantern blown out by the wind. Ikena felt the weight of hunger and cold. Without money, he couldn't even buy a piece of roasted yam at the stalls. His stomach roared like distant thunder, and each rumble reminded him that comfort had become a mirage. With nowhere to stay, he spotted a small inn, with peeling walls and a zinc roof that creaked in the wind. The owner, a woman with a severe face and rough hands, looked at him suspiciously. "We have no rooms for men without money," she said. Ikena pleaded, knelt on the cold floor, clutched the hem of her skirt. "I'll pay later. I just need a corner." The woman sighed, and with a curt gesture, pointed to a small room in the back, with a thin mat and a stained blanket. There, Ikena lay down for the first time without Egyptian cotton sheets, without imported perfume on the pillow. The smell was of mold, damp floor, real life. With every breath, he felt his chest sink deeper. That night, the only music was the barking of hungry dogs and the creaking of the zinc roof. Exhaustion overcame the pain but didn't silence the voices in his head. "You're the son of a rich man. How did you end up like this? Where are your friends, your parties, your empty laughter?" Shame gnawed at his soul, each piece ripped off like living skin. At dawn, hunger pushed him back into the street. With no money, he wandered among the stalls, watching food scraps fall to the ground, fought over by skinny dogs. The smell of burnt oil and roasted corn drove him mad. At one moment, he eyed a plate of leftovers in a cart's corner, and for an instant, He considered grabbing it, but pride still held his hand like an invisible chain. Little by little, Ikenna discovered that life outside the mansion walls was a shadowless jungle, where every step demanded courage and every sip required sacrifice. He began to beg for scraps of conversation, scraps of food, scraps of dignity. In every face that ignored him, he saw a mirror of himself, the man who once turned his face away from those who knocked at his door asking for bread. One late afternoon, almost fainting, he sat on a log beside the dry river, staring at the stagnant water between the rocks. His feet were swollen, his hands dirty, his beard starting to grow unkempt. The boy who was once a king now looked like a wanderer. In that damp solitude, Ikenna repeated to himself, like a bitter spell, "He'll pay me for this humiliation. He'll pay." It was a phrase he clung to keep from sinking completely. But deep inside, a fragile whisper asked, "Is it really the father's fault? Or was it the world collecting the debt of your indifference?" In the village, children ran past laughing, not knowing that the man on the log was the heir to lands that once seemed infinite. Women walked by with baskets of cassava and bananas, glancing at him with distant compassion, as if they were seeing a stray dog. In the silence of dusk, the sky turned red like fresh blood, announcing another cold night. Ikenna stood up with difficulty, his legs heavy as soaked logs. He dragged himself back to the inn. On that crooked, dusty road, for the first time in many years, he felt that each step was paid with sweat, with pain, with truth. Luxury was a distant ghost, and vanity no longer fit in his hungry body, and it was there, on that road, that the seed of transformation began to sprout, still small, almost invisible, but alive. Because sometimes you have to tear the skin of the soul to be reborn, and Ikenna, without even realizing it, was beginning to walk, not as an heir, but as a man. Dawn arrived grey, like a badly washed sheet hanging in the wind. Ikenna woke up to the metallic crowing of roosters and the hurried footsteps outside. His body ached as if it had been beaten all night. His bones cracked as he got up, his skin stuck to the rough fabric of his clothes. Looking around, he saw nothing but peeling walls, a cracked bucket, and a sliver of soap. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the patchy beard, the cold sweat. He took a deep breath. In that breath, there was still a thin thread of vanity, but each day pulled more of it away. The innkeeper kicked him out early, saying she needed the room for someone who could pay. Ikenna, clutching the small bundle that now held his only belongings, stumbled into the street, eyes on the dusty ground. He had no destination, only a hidden desire, to find his father and break the punishment that burned in his chest like a live ember. He wandered aimlessly, stumbling over stones, dodging stalls, hearing children's laughter and the shouts of vendors, the smell of fried cassava flour, fish baking in the sun, and rotting fruit mixed together. A memory of a life he had never known how to live. Turning into a narrow alley, Ikenna saw a large iron gate creaking in the wind. Above it, a faded sign read, "Manufacturing and Repairs Factory." It wasn't a place that drew attention. It was one of those corners of the world where men and women carry the weight of daily bread, where dignity is measured in calloused hands and sweat-soaked faces. Inside, the sound of hammers, welding sparks, heavy boxes dragged across the floor, a chorus of deep voices, sharp orders, noises that pounded like war drums on the chest of anyone unfamiliar with hard labor. Ikenna stopped at the door, heart pounding. A foreman looked him up and down, eyes hard as stone. "What do you want here?" "Lost, pretty boy," Ikenna stammered, his voice choked. "I'm looking for work, anything." The foreman laughed, a short, dry laugh. "Work? We don't play pretend here. Here we sweat, bleed, eat when we can. You up for that?" Ikenna lowered his eyes and only nodded. Then, from the back of the yard, an old thin man appeared. His back bent, hair already grey. He wore a jumpsuit, stained with grease and dust, a shovel in his hands. His steps were slow but firm, each footprint sinking into the mud as a testament to endurance. His small, deep eyes held an ocean of stories. It was Baba Ayo, but there, he wasn't the landowner, the millionaire, the feared man of the village. He was just another worker, another body among iron and dust. Ikenna didn't recognize him at first. He only saw an old, frail man with a gaze that pierced beyond skin and lies. When their eyes met, Baba Ayo gripped the shovel tighter. Inside, his heart shook like bamboo in the wind. His son stood there, thin, hollow-eyed, the once proud face now covered in dust and shame. He wanted to run to him, embrace him, wipe every tear with his hands, say, "My son, come home." But he held back, because sometimes love is holding the embrace, letting pain teach where words can't reach. Ikena felt a shiver down his spine. There was something strange about that old man, a warmth in his eyes, a silence that screamed, but his confused mind couldn't understand it. He followed the foreman's orders, receiving a broom and a leaky bucket. The work was to sweep the yard, push dust that returned with every gust of wind, carry garbage to the corner, push dirty water into the drains. Every pull of the broom scratched his soul. The air, once used to commanding, now bent his back, his skin burning under the sun. The blisters on his hands burst, stinging like hot coals. The smell of grease filled his nostrils and clung to his hair. His thirst burned, but water was rationed, given in cracked plastic cups only after the foreman's signal. The old Baba Ao watched from afar. Each fall of his son felt like a knife to his chest. When Ikena stumbled over buckets or knelt exhausted, Baba Ao turned away, holding back tears with gritted teeth, looking up at the sky and murmuring, "Lord, give me strength not to run to him now. Give me courage to let him be born." At the end of the first day, Ikena collapsed onto the ground, his hands shaking. Sweat dripped, mixing with tears. The foreman let out a laugh, giving up. "Pretty boy, tomorrow, there's more." Ikena didn't answer. He stared at the floor, as if looking into an abyss. That night, he slept in a corner of the warehouse, on empty cement sacks. His body complained in every muscle. The wounds burned like fire. The factory sounds, even silenced, still echoed in his mind. He dreamed of the old soft bed, long baths, silver cutlery. But he woke with a dry throat and a face crusted with dust. When he opened his eyes, he saw the old worker passing by, with a wheelbarrow full of rubble. For a moment, their eyes met again, and there, deep in those tired eyes, something stirred inside Ikena. A flash of familiarity, a tightening in the chest, a longing he didn't even know he had. But he quickly looked away, ashamed. He didn't know that old man carried in silence every tear, every prayer whispered in lonely dawns, every coin that once supported his whims. The next day started the same, but something in the air felt different. Ikena got up earlier, picked up the broom without being called, began cleaning before orders came. The foreman watched, puzzled. The old man, from afar, almost let a smile slip, but quickly swallowed it. It wasn't time to soften his heart. Each day in the factory was a silent sermon. The dirty floor was the pulpit, the sweat was the prayer, the calluses were the psalms. Ikena, even without understanding, began to hear these wordless prayers. And the old man, each night, knelt in a dark corner of his makeshift room, eyes brimming with tears, whispering, "Let him understand, Lord. Let him see the root before he wants the fruit." And so passed the silent reunion, full of pain and invisible seeds, a father and son, separated by walls of pride and shame, but united by an invisible thread called love. A love that doesn't shout, doesn't pound its chest, but stays there, firm as a rock, waiting for the right day to bloom. In those iron and mud corridors, destiny began to weave a new fabric, a fabric not made of luxury, but of dignity, of truth, of earth. And each hammer blow, each shout from the foreman, each dragging step of the old man was a stitch in this silent weave, which one day would become the cloak of redemption. The days at the factory repeated like an old chant, heavy with pain and dust. The sound of hammers mixed with the groaning of iron being shaped, while Ikena, head down, pushed brooms, carried buckets, mended sacks. His body was no longer the same. Hands once soft as silk were now rough, marked with cuts and calluses that burned at the slightest touch. His face, once smooth and perfumed, now bore deep lines, dust, and a hardened expression, as if he had aged years in just a few months. The men around him watched with a mix of distrust and curiosity. They knew he was an outsider, someone not born for that ground, but who, day by day, was sinking into it. And amid all that greyness, a spark of color appeared, like a stubborn flower sprouting from a crack in stone. It was a hot morning, the sun burning early, making the air dance in waves over the yard. Ikena dragged himself along, pushing a wheelbarrow of rubble that seemed twice his weight. Sweat ran in rivers down his neck, sticking his shirt to his chest. Then he heard a soft, yet firm voice echo beside him. If you push like that, you'll hurt your back. Let me show you." He turned, surprised, and saw a young woman with deep eyes, thin but strong arms, and a contained smile that seemed to hold the world's secrets. She wore a cloth tied around her head to protect her hair from the dust, and she carried a bucket of clothes on her head with almost poetic grace. She introduced herself as Ngozi, a washerwoman from a nearby village. She lived with her grandmother, a blind woman full of proverbs, and dreamed of having a small space to sew, where she could teach other girls to embroider and sell at the market. She was not a woman of empty words, but of gestures that spoke loudly. Ngozi looked at Ikena as if reading an open book. She saw beyond the torn clothes and sweat, into the wounded man hiding behind those lowered eyes. Without asking permission, she took the wheelbarrow from his hands, adjusted the position, and showed him how to distribute the weight to avoid straining his arms and back. Ikena, embarrassed, tried to protest. I know how to do it," but his voice came out weak, almost a whisper. Ngozi just laughed, a short, vibrant laugh full of life. "You don't know anything, but you'll learn. Every man learns when he has to carry not just the wheelbarrow, but life." That encounter, seemingly simple, was the first breath of fresh air in Ikena's suffocated chest. For the first time, someone corrected him without fear, without flattery, without interest. Those firm hands held more than the wheelbarrow they held, unknowingly, his destiny. In the following days, Ngozi returned to the factory, delivering washed clothes to workers or fetching water from the courtyard well. Each time she passed, she left a trail of curious silence. The men stopped to look, not for her beauty, though she was beautiful in her simplicity, but for the silent strength she carried. One afternoon, Ikena saw her balancing 2 basins of clothes on her head, walking with firm steps and a straight back. He ran to help, grabbing one of the basins. She looked at him in surprise but didn't protest. For the first time, Ikena felt that a small gesture could be worth more than any jewel. As they walked together, Ngozi spoke of her grandmother, a woman who, even blind, made lace and taught the village girls to embroider their own stories. She told how she had learned from childhood to wash for others, to share the little she had, to smile even with a growling stomach. She spoke with a sparkle in her eyes that contrasted with the harshness of the ground. When they reached the riverbank, Ngozi began scrubbing clothes vigorously, beating soap against the stones. Ikena stood, still, watching. He had never seen anyone wash clothes. It looked like a ritual, a dance between hands, foam, and current. The sun reflected on the water, lighting up her focused face. "Why do you do this alone? Isn't it too heavy?" he asked, almost voiceless. Ngozi paused, lifted her eyes to him. "Heavy is living without purpose. Clothes you wash, dry, wear again. But a dirty heart, no soap can cleanse that. Understand?" Ikena felt a chill. Her words cut into him like a blade. He wanted to speak, but swallowed air, feeling a hot wave rise to his face. Ngozi gave a slight smile, as if she already knew that reaction. On the way back, she asked if he had a steady job yet. He replied that he still swept the yard and carried trash when told. Ngozi thought for a moment, then said, "Next week, they'll need help in the loading shed. If you want, I can recommend you, but be warned, there, the work is rough. A man who can't handle it goes home limping." He nodded. For the first time, he didn't feel ashamed of being seen as weak. Something inside him begged to be rebuilt, from the ground up, and Ngozi seemed to be the quiet cement of this new foundation. Days passed, and seeing Ngozi became routine. Sometimes she brought him a piece of cooked cassava, other times just a short word, but loaded with strength. "Head up," she'd say, when he passed by, dragging his steps. "Or the mud that dirties you today can be the clay that shapes you tomorrow." In the village, the murmurs started. "Who's this washerwoman, walking with Baba Ao's son?" they asked. "Did she bewitch the boy?" others whispered. But Ngozi didn't care. She carried on, caring for her grandmother, washing clothes, planting invisible seeds in tired hearts. For Ikena, each encounter with her was a silent lesson. Pride wilted like a leaf in the sun. His chest, once swollen with titles and inheritance, now opened to a new kind of wealth, the value of a gesture, the power of a true word. And in that slow rhythm, between factory dust and river foam, Ikena began to see life with different eyes, eyes that didn't seek applause, but meaning, eyes that learned, day by day, the difference between owning everything and owning oneself. Ngozi, without realizing it, became not just the woman who would change everything, but the mirror where he finally began to see himself, not as an heir, not as Baba Ayo's son, but as a man. And there, a man wasn't the one who had the most. He was the one who endured, who shared, who stayed even when the ground trembled. Life, in that forgotten corner of the world, began to teach Ikenna that the greatest fortunes are born from calloused hands and hearts cleansed of lies. And as he pushed wheelbarrows and picked up trash, the seed of a new destiny began to sprout. A destiny woven by a washerwoman, stitched in the mud, watered with silent tears. The sun rose lazily, spreading a weak light over the zinc roofs and the damp mud of the alleys. The rooster's crow mixed with the clatter of buckets at the well and the shuffle of sandals on the sidewalks. It was another day beginning, the same for everyone, but inside Ikenna, a silent new dawn was already stirring. He woke before the rooster crowed, his muscles throbbing, his hands heavy as if carrying stones. He left the inn with sleep still marked on his face, his stomach empty, but something different vibrated in his chest. When he arrived at the factory, he found Ngozi waiting with a short smile and a look that seemed to already know all the world's pains. She handed him a small bowl of thin porridge, made from corn and water. It wasn't a feast, but for Ikenna, it felt like a gift from the heavens. "Don't work on an empty stomach," she said, almost like an old proverb. He held the bowl carefully, as if it were rare porcelain, and slowly swallowed each spoonful, feeling the warmth slide down his throat and heat his chest. The taste was simple, almost without salt, but it was the first meal that felt like it had a soul. After the porridge, Ngozi accompanied him to the loading shed. There, the work was harder than anything he had ever faced. Heavy sacks of grain, iron crates, thick ropes that burned the skin with the slightest slip. Sweat poured like rain, soaking his shirt, sticking dust to his body. His arms trembled, his chest heaved, and each step felt like a march across an endless desert. During one of these shifts, as he tried to lift a sack of rice bigger than himself, Ikenna felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. His legs buckled, his body crashed down, his face hit the hard earth. Pain exploded in his palm, opened into a deep cut. Hot red blood began to run between his fingers. Ngozi ran to him, dropping her laundry basin to the ground. She held his hand firmly, examined the wound, and without saying a word, tore a piece of the cloth that covered her hair. Carefully, she washed his hand in a bucket of dirty water, blowing gently to soothe the sting. While she cleaned, her eyes never left his. A man who doesn't know how to care for a wound will never know how to care for a home. The phrase entered him like a spear, breaking the last bits of pride that still resisted inside. Ikenna looked down, felt the salt of his tears mix with the blood, sliding down his cheek. He didn't know how to explain the crying. It wasn't just from the pain in his hand, nor from the shame of falling in front of others. It was an old crying, hidden in silences, muffled during parties, drowned by false laughter. Ngozi tied the cloth carefully, tight enough to stop the bleeding but not to hurt more. Then she passed her thumb across his cheek, wiping away a tear. It was a small gesture, but in that moment it felt bigger than any fortune. That day Ikenna returned home with his hand bandaged, his body wrecked, but his mind brighter than ever. The silence of the walk weighed heavy, and he repeated Ngozi's phrase to himself like a sacred chant. The next day, even with his hand throbbing, he returned to work. There was no room for excuses, no soft bed to hide in. The foreman, seeing him arrive, let out a mocking laugh, but said nothing. The other workers just shook their heads, some with silent respect, others still with disdain. With every sack lifted, every dragged step, Ikenna felt not only the weight of the load, but the weight of old choices. He remembered the nights when he dismissed advice, laughed at his father's worries, saw humble women as voiceless shadows. Between one load and another, Ikenna began to observe more. He watched Ngozi wash clothes, fold cloths carefully, smile at each customer who arrived with dirty bags. He watched the old men fixing tools, the mothers selling fritters by the roadside, the barefoot boys running round, dirty but with a light. In their eyes, humility, which once felt like a distant word to him, began to become a living matter, seeping into his pores. He felt, for the first time, that he wasn't greater than anyone, that the world didn't revolve around his name, nor the money tied to his last name. One afternoon, while collecting buckets in the yard, Ikenna saw a small boy, wearing torn shorts and with injured feet, standing by the gate. The boy stared fixedly at a piece of bread, forgotten on a wooden bench. Without thinking, Ikenna picked up the bread, approached, and held it out. The boy grabbed it with shining eyes, smiled, and ran away. Turning back, Ikenna saw Ngozi standing at the shed entrance, arms crossed, watching in silence. Her gaze was a mix of surprise and tenderness, like someone seeing a flower sprouting from stone. She didn't say anything, but the faint smile she gave was enough to light up his chest. That night, lying on the hard floor of his room, Ikenna ran his fingers over the makeshift bandage on his hand. The cut stung, but what hurt most was the memory of his vanity, the words he once used to hurt his father, the empty laughs with friends who had vanished. He closed his eyes, and in the dark, saw his father's face, a tired face, but full of hope, the same face he had ignored so many times. He whispered, almost like a prayer, I didn't know how blind I was." The pain in the wound was now a loyal companion, a reminder that each drop of spilled blood was a piece of the old Ikenna dying. The first seeds of humility, planted by firm hands and true words, began to sprout, and if before he ran from the ground, now it was the ground that held his uncertain steps, guiding him onto a path he had never imagined walking. The man who once saw himself as a tongueless king was now learning to serve himself, and each fallen tear, each formed callus, each silent gesture of kindness was a brick in the reconstruction of his soul, a soul that, finally, began to become a home. Dawn arrived slowly, as if it too wanted to witness the slow awakening of the man who once thought himself untouchable. Ikenna woke with his body still heavy, but something in his heart already pulsed differently. His bandaged hand throbbed with each movement, reminding him that every step now cost sweat, pain, and humility. He left early, before the foreman's first shouts echoed across the yard. He walked in silence to the well, washed his face with cold water that bit at his skin, as if trying to strip away the last layers of pride still clinging to him. Lifting his face, he saw Ngozi approaching with a basket on her head. The basket looked heavy, but she walked firmly, balancing herself like someone carrying not just clothes, but dreams. "Good morning," he murmured, almost embarrassed, as if the words were new in his mouth. Ngozi stopped, looked at him, and gave a slight smile. "Good morning, man with calloused hands," she replied. Setting the basket on the ground, Ikenna offered to help, but she refused with a gentle gesture. "The basket isn't as heavy as the choices we carry," she said, holding his gaze for a few seconds. He lowered his head, feeling the weight of that phrase hammering in his chest. Throughout the day, Ikenna worked in the loading shed. The sacks felt heavier than ever. The ropes burned his hands even through the bandages. Still, he persisted. There was no more space for excuses or complaints. Each drop of sweat was a brick in the construction of a new man. When the sun was high, hunger began to claw at his stomach. It was a dry hunger, scratching his ribs from the inside. He remembered the lavish banquets he had left half-eaten, the fine dishes, the desserts he never even tasted. Going out for some air, he walked to the back of the factory. That was when he saw a scene that shattered the last wall of vanity inside. Ngozi was sitting under a tree with a piece of hardened bread in her hands. Next to her was a skinny dog, its ribs showing, eyes pleading. Without hesitation, Ngozi tore the bread in half. She gave the bigger piece to the dog, and kept the smaller one for herself. The animal ate quickly, as if afraid it was only a mirage. She, meanwhile, chewed slowly, watching the dog with tenderness. Ikenna stood frozen, as if time had stopped. His throat tightened, his eyes burned. He approached but found no words. His silence said everything, and she understood. Ngozi turned her face to him, smiled softly, and said, "Those who share the little they have multiply what they are inside." He sat down beside her, feeling the rough ground, the dust rising around his ankles. They stayed there, sharing the silence. He looked at the bread in her hand, as if it were a rare jewel. It wasn't about the bread itself, but the gesture, the act of sharing even when you have almost nothing. Ikenna's mind drifted. He remembered the table at home, covered with delicacies, imported fruits, expensive wines. He remembered pushing away untouched plates, despising the work of those who prepared each dish. He remembered empty laughs as he threw pieces of meat on the floor, mocking the servants who tried to please him. There, in that moment, a bitter taste rose in his mouth, different from any spoiled food. It was the taste of shame, of a conscience, finally opening its eyes. The bread in Ngiozi's hand looked like an altar, and the hungry dog, a silent angel teaching him about value, about roots, about truth. Ngiozi broke the silence again. You know, we don't just die from stomach hunger. We also die from soul hunger. Many out there have full plates but dry hearts. Ikenna couldn't hold back his tears. His hands trembled. His chest heaved. He bowed his head. The tears fell too. The ground, forming small muddy puddles in the dust. Ngiozi said nothing, just reached out and held his hand. A simple gesture, but it carried the weight of 1,000 sermons. After that day, Ikenna began to eat every piece of fufu, every spoon of beans, as if it were the last. No crumb was ever wasted again. When he received a handful of flour, he silently gave thanks, remembering the dog, the bread, the falling tears. Little by little, the workers began to notice. The young man who once worked grudgingly, now offered help, shared the little he had, smiled even with dirty clothes and an aching back. A man who learns the value of food also learns the value of life. At night, lying on his mat, Ikenna remembered each bite, each smell, each texture. Every meal became a sacred ritual, an invitation to gratitude. And in the silence of the room, between the scurry of rats and the dripping roof, he murmured short prayers, heavy with pain and hope. From afar, old Baba Ayo watched everything. Every step of his son was a knife and a bomb. The father saw his son die slowly to be reborn in silence. In the solitude of his shack, Baba Ayo knelt on the cold floor, thanking God for the harshness of the path. Lord, let him understand that abundance begins in the heart. Let him learn that sharing does not impoverish but enriches the soul. And so, in the quiet sharing of a piece of hardened bread, in the gaze of a forgotten dog, in the firm hand of a washerwoman, Ikenna rediscovered not just the value of food, but the taste of life. A life finally chewed with gratitude, swallowed with respect, digested with humility. There, under that tree, on the dusty ground, a new man was born. A man who, before satisfying his stomach, learned to feed his soul. And this, perhaps, was the most urgent hunger he had never known how to name. Night fell slowly, spreading a dark cloak over the village. Lanterns flickered in the corners of mud houses, casting long shadows on the walls. The wind blew cold, carrying the smell of burning wood, roasted corn, and a quiet longing. Old Baba Ayo, sitting hidden behind the shed, watched with heavy eyes. The days had been long, dragging on like a sorrowful chant. Every step of his son was a deep cut in the father's heart. The man who was once seen as untouchable was now just a thin figure, covered in dust and patches. Baba Ayo, disguised in his stained jumpsuit, pretended not to see, but each gesture of Ikenna burned in his soul. That night, the air felt denser. The moon, thin as a blade, hid behind thick clouds. Inside the shed, Ikenna was finishing stacking the last sacks of corn. The foreman had already left, and the other workers had disappeared into the alleys. Ngozi, beside him, was carefully folding wet cloths, preparing to take them back to her grandmother. Ikenna seemed strange. His body still ached, but his face carried another kind of pain, one not seen in bone or muscle. He looked at the ground, scratched his head, inhaled as if searching for courage in the wind. Ngozi noticed. She stopped folding and turned to him, resting the basin on the floor. "Speak up. This silence is heavier than the rice sacks," she said in a soft yet firm tone. Ikenna took a deep breath. His hand trembled, his voice broke, like a forgotten chant. I wanted to say sorry." He stopped, swallowed hard, felt a bitter taste rise to his mouth. "That day, when I yelled at you, when I pushed you, I was blind." The silence between them was so thick, it was possible to hear a distant cricket chirping. Ngozi looked at him steadily, her eyes shining under the faint light. "I didn't know words hurt more than stones. I didn't know that hurting someone meant carrying a weight that no river water can wash away." The words came out like thorns being pulled from his flesh. Hidden, Baba Ayo leaned against the rough wall, his chest heaving. His hand trembled, gripping the handle of the hoe he used to keep his disguise. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he forced himself to stay silent. Ngozi kept watching. After a long moment, she knelt, took a clean cloth, approached, and wiped his face, clearing the sweat and dust. "Apologies aren't just said with the mouth. They're said with the body, with silence, with change. You're trying, and that's worth more than 1,000 empty apologies," she whispered, almost like a prayer. Ikena let his face sink into her hand, tears mixing with the soap still left on the cloth. It was the first time he allowed himself to cry in front of someone since he had collapsed at the gate of the old mansion. It was an ugly, heavy cry, full of trapped sobs. But it was a clean cry, washing away the last shells of vanity. Baba Eo, hidden, bit his lip to keep from letting out a loud lament. The old man felt his heart beat like a drum. He finally saw his son bend, not to money, but to truth. He saw his son undress, not from clothes, but from pride. There, in the dark shed, there were no applause, no choir to celebrate. But for Baba Eo, it was the grandest moment he had ever witnessed. Not his son buying a new car, not signing contracts, not laughing at parties. It was his son, finally, becoming a man. When Ngozi finished wiping his face, she took his wounded hands and looked at every callus, every crack, as if reading an old book. These hands will still build many things, but only if the heart helps to carry them, she said. Ikena just nodded, too weak to speak. He knelt right there, holding her hands as if holding an amulet against the desert. Seeing that scene, Baba Eo bowed his head, leaned on the hoe. He cried softly, like someone praying. He whispered to the ground, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you for not letting me give up on him. Thank you for this son, who now begins to bloom in pain." The night went on, cold and silent. Ngozi pulled Ikena up. "Come on. Tomorrow the sun rises early, and work doesn't wait for anyone." He stood up slowly, still holding her hand, as if afraid that by letting go, he might lose himself again. They left the shed walking side by side. The lanterns lit in the distant houses flickered like nearby stars. The cold ground, the sharp breeze, everything seemed to sing a new song. A song of new beginnings, of repentance, of hope. Behind them, Baba Eo stood still. The old man looked at the dark sky, breathed deeply. His chest hurt, but it was a good pain, a healing pain. He knew the road would still be long, full of stones, falls, cold nights. But he also knew that, for the first time, his son had taken the first step. In that moment, without Ikena knowing, the father began to believe in tomorrow again. He believed once more that a man is not made by the gold that shines, but by the clay that shapes him. And, in silence, the old man returned to his corner, his soul light, as if finally carrying a seed ready to sprout. Dawn arrived with a softer, almost lazy rooster's crow, as if the whole world was breathing more calmly that day. Ikena woke before the sun broke the sky. His body protested. His muscles felt like overstretched ropes, but there was a burning inside him now, not a flame of pride, but of will. He left the inn room with firm steps, no longer dragging his feet as before. The smell of wet mud from the night before rose, bringing back childhood memories, moments when he ran barefoot, before gold blinded his eyes. In that silent hallway, Ikena ran his fingers over the bandage on his wounded hand, remembering in touch, the words that still echoed like a soft thunder in his mind. When he arrived at the factory yard, he found Ngozi already up, holding a bundle of colorful fabrics, almost bigger than she was. Her eyes shone with an old purpose, the kind inherited from grandmothers, mothers, and the women who hold up the world with one hand and feed it with the other. "Today we're not going to the shed," she said, adjusting the cloth on her head. Ikena stopped, confused. "We're not," she smiled, holding back a mischievous laugh. "Today you're coming with me to the fair. I need someone to carry these pieces, and they say you've got strong arms now." He opened his mouth to protest, but before he could, Ngozi was already walking, quick steps leaving a trail of dust and soap scent. With no choice, he ran after her, holding one of the bundles she had pushed against his chest. The walk to the fair was long, winding through dirt trails, crossing crooked wooden bridges, passing under big mango trees where children played and old women rested on mats. At each step, Ikena felt the villagers' eyes on him. Some recognized the rich man's son, others just saw a sweaty man, carrying bundles on his head. When they arrived at the fair's entrance, the noise was a sea of voices, vendors shouting, prices, women haggling, chickens clucking, small drums beating in the distance. The air was a mosaic of fresh fish, roasted corn, spicy spices, and sweet fruits. Ikena's stomach growled, but something bigger than hunger filled his chest. Ngozi set up a small space under an old mango tree. She spread a stained sheet on the ground, laid out her pieces of fabric, simple embroideries, headscarves, and small handmade dresses. There was no luxury, no shine, but there was soul in every stitch, in every line sewn patiently by lamplight. "Hold this," she ordered, handing him an improvised clothesline made of thick ropes. He obeyed. Slowly, the pieces filled the space, creating a colorful garden in that corner of the fair. Women passing by stopped, touched the fabrics, nodded in approval. Without noticing, Ikenna began observing people, listening to the hidden stories in each face. An old lady bought a scarf to cover her head on Sunday. A mother bought a small dress for the baby in her arms. A man bought a piece of fabric as a gift for his sick wife at home. He held change, helped fold pieces, and smiled without forcing it. For the first time, he felt pride not in selling something expensive, but in seeing the light in people's eyes when they received something simple, made with love. A young man approached, looking at Ikenna with curiosity. "Do you work with her?" he asked, surprised. Ikenna paused, then smiled, filling his chest as he replied, "Yes, I carry the pieces, hold the line, help however I can." The young man laughed sincerely and shook his hand. Good to see a man helping a woman without shame. That's rare. The phrase echoed in Ikenna's mind. He who once despised any task he considered beneath him, was now holding clotheslines, counting coins, smiling at each customer, and in each small gesture, he felt more like a man than in all the years he had paraded at parties holding shiny glasses. As the day went on, the fair got crowded, the music grew louder, drums beat stronger, children ran with colorful lollipops. The heat was suffocating, but Ingjosi didn't stop. She offered her pieces patiently, told the story of each embroidery, explained the meaning behind each design. Ikenna listened, learned, and silently marveled at her strength. On a moment of rest, they sat under the mango tree and shared a piece of roasted cassava bought with the day's earnings. Ikenna looked at her hands, marked by soap and needles, and realized he had never met a woman so rich, not in coins, but in soul. "Do you like doing this?" he asked, biting the cassava. Ngozi looked at the people around, at the clothesline swaying in the wind, at the coins spread on the cloth. "I like seeing fabric turn into stories, seeing someone leave here with a piece of me. Work gives dignity, but creating connects." Ikenna fell silent. He chewed slowly, watching the fair's movement. The noise, the heat, the smells, everything seemed to pulse with his heart. He had never felt so alive, so present. At the end of the day, while they were packing up, Ngozi looked at him and said, "Today, you didn't work for money, but for value. The value of helping, of being, of sharing." He felt tears rise, but held them back. He just gripped the clothesline tighter, looking at the ground, trying to store that moment quietly inside his chest. They returned to the village at dusk, carrying the leftover pieces and some coins wrapped in a cloth. The path seemed shorter, the breeze cooler. That night, lying on the thin mat, Ikenna repeated to himself, "Today I sold fabrics, but I bought pieces of truth." And he fell asleep with a heart as light as the cloth swaying on the line, knowing, deep down, that the greatest profit was discovering himself a man, not by what he owned, but by what he gave. Night arrived heavy, starless, like a thick blanket over the village. The smell of burning firewood drifted through the air, mixed with the distant sound of drums announcing parties somewhere far away. But in Ikenna's heart, there was no party. There was a deep silence, a desert where he walked alone, each step burying old memories deeper. After the fair, every joint in his body ached, but it was a different kind of pain, a pain that didn't ask for medicine, but for reflection. His face burned from the sun, his hands bore marks from the ropes. The scent of soap and dust mixed with sweat, all this formed a new skin over him, a skin that didn't shine, but breathed truth. He walked toward the shed, where he knew he would find the old worker who always swept the yard. The old man, who went unnoticed by everyone else, carried a mystery for Ike. There was something in his silent gaze, something in the way he held the broom, in the way he watched each detail with the care of someone tending a fragile garden. Baba Ao, hidden behind his disguise, was there, pushing the broom slowly, as if sweeping not just the ground but thoughts, pains, ghosts. He heard Ikenna's footsteps approaching but didn't turn. He felt the air change, the weight of his son's thoughts floating around like smoke. Ikenna stood there, watching the old man in silence. His chest rose and fell quickly, as if he carried a storm inside. He wanted to speak, but his tongue weighed like stone. Finally, he let out a long sigh, as if releasing a confession into the wind. My father, he taught me to own, but he never taught me to be a man. The words fell on the shed floor like shards of glass. The old man stopped sweeping but didn't turn. He only gripped the broom handle so hard that his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded, each beat a drum of celebration and mourning at once. Ikenna continued, his eyes shining in the dim light. He gave me everything, a big house, servants, a name that made everyone bow their heads. But he never gave me ground, never showed me the weight of a plate of food, nor the value of a tear, shed in silence. The old man closed his eyes, feeling his chest tear open. Inside, he wanted to scream, to run to his son, hold him in his arms and say, "Forgive me, my son." But he knew that moment wasn't his. It belonged to the son. Silence was the last teacher left. I thought being a man meant giving orders, never apologizing, never bowing your head. But today I see, being a man is sharing bread, even when it's small. It's holding someone's hand when the whole world turns away. Being a man is carrying shame in your chest and still moving forward. Tears streamed down Ikenna's face, thick, mixing with sweat. He breathed deeply, as if trying to swallow the entire world, to spit out all the pride that choked him. I blamed my father for everything. I thought he was the enemy. I thought it was his duty to guarantee my happiness, to keep my smile alive. But the truth is, I didn't know how to smile without an audience. I didn't know how to live without applause. The old Baba Ao held each word like someone holding a clay jar full of water, afraid it might break and spill everything. He felt his own face wet but didn't move. His whole body trembled, but he stood still, like a pillar holding up a collapsing roof. I was blind, and deep down, I always hoped he would show up to save me. But today I understood. No one saves someone who doesn't want to be saved. Ikenna dropped to his knees, the dry thud echoing through the empty shed. His hands touched the dusty floor, his face pressed against the cold cement. There, in that position, he looked like a child finally giving up the tantrum and asking to be held. The old man turned slowly, his legs feeling like soft clay. He looked at his son on the ground, head bowed, soul stripped bare. He wanted to run to him, but his body didn't obey. He just stood there, breathing heavily, his heart beating in every vein. I wish I had been man enough to say thank you before, to see you not as my enemy, but as the only one who truly loved me. Today I know ... I don't need to own anything. I just need to be worthy of someone. And that someone I found in a woman who showed me that love is not a showcase, it's a root. The old man dropped the broom, which hit the ground with a hollow sound. He took a step forward, then another, each step more difficult than the last. He reached close to his son, extended his hand, but pulled it back at the last moment. It wasn't time yet. Ikenna stayed, kneeling there, chest heaving, face pressed to the floor, as if trying to absorb every speck of dust, to forever remember where he came from. Baba Ao took a step back, clutching his own hands. He wanted to say he was proud, that each tear of his son was a diamond worth more than all the lands, all the gold in the world. But he swallowed the words. He knew that silence, in that moment, was the greatest embrace he could give. The sun stayed there for minutes that felt like hours. When he finally stood up, he looked at the old man, his eyes red but steady. No words were spoken, the gaze said it all. That night, as he walked back to his room, Ikenna repeated every phrase he had spilled onto the shed floor. He felt light, as if he had removed a rusty armor that had weighed on him for years. For the first time, he felt proud not of his surname, but of the silence that remained after the tears. The old Baba Ao returned to his corner. He sat down, held his face in his hands, and wept softly, an old cry, stored since the day he buried his wife and promised her he would protect their son. In that cry, there was pain, but also gratitude. In that cold, empty shed, two men were reborn. A father who learned that true love is also letting a son fall, and a son who discovered that the greatest victory is not conquering the world, but conquering oneself. The sun rose red like embers, announcing a different kind of day. The rooster's crow seemed longer, like a trumpet announcing change. Ikenna woke before any movement stirred in the village. There was no sound of footsteps, no creaking of wooden gates. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a gesture from him. Sitting on his thin mat, Ikenna held a small ring in his hands, simple, molded by a local blacksmith from leftover metal. It had no precious stones, no shiny gold, just a modest circle, but one loaded with meaning. He had helped polish it himself, asking the blacksmith for guidance, learning each hammer strike, each curve that fire forced the metal to accept. Looking at that ring, he saw not just a piece of jewelry, but an entire story. Every sack carried, every swallowed tear, every piece of bread shared. The walk to Ngiozi's house felt longer that day. Each step was a drumbeat inside his chest, his mind filled with memories, like waves breaking on the shore. He remembered the empty parties, the fake laughs, the scent of imported perfume that couldn't hide the emptiness. Now, there was only the smell of soap, the sound of birds, and the quiet weight of that ring hidden in his palm. Arriving at Ngiozi's house, he saw her grandmother sitting on the doorstep, her eyes faded by age, but alive in spirit. She smiled when she felt his presence, as if seeing with her heart what her eyes could no longer grasp. "You came," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. Ikenna knelt before her, held her fragile hands, and there, in a dense silence, asked for her blessing before asking for Ngiozi's hand. The grandmother ran her wrinkled hand over his head, whispering ancient words, words from before, big houses, before titles, before pride. Ngiozi appeared at the door, holding a wet cloth. When she saw Ikenna kneeling, she stopped. Time seemed to stretch like a river refusing to flow. He stood up slowly, breathing deeply. The ring shone shyly in his hand. "I didn't bring gold. I didn't bring diamonds. I only brought what I managed to gather from myself," he began, his voice firm but choked. Ngiozi didn't move. Her large, deep eyes followed every word, as if reading a prayer. "I want you to be my foundation, not my display. I want you to be the ground where I learn to stand, not an ornament for others to applaud." His hands trembled but did not drop the ring. The village was so quiet you could hear the rustling of leaves on distant mango trees. Slowly, neighbors began to appear, drawn by an invisible force. Curious children, women holding basins, men laying down their hoes. Ikenna knelt on the dirt ground, dirtying his knees without hesitation. He raised his hand with the ring, his eyes locked on hers. "I have no riches, but I have will. I have no last name to promise you palaces, but I have courage to promise you effort. If you agree to walk with me, I promise to honor you not with parties, but with simple days, not with expensive toasts, but with silences full of peace." Ngiozi's breath seemed trapped in her chest. Her eyes filled with tears, and a single tear ran down, cutting through the dust on her face. She stepped forward, knelt, and held his face with both hands. "A man who kneels in the mud to ask for a woman rises higher than any king," she whispered, words only for him. Ngiozi took the ring carefully, looked at it as if it were a fallen star. Then she put it on her finger, looking at the gathered village. She didn't need to say yes out loud. The gesture spoke louder than any word. The women began to cry, some hiding their faces in their aprons. The men nodded, murmuring that they had never seen such an act of humility and courage. The children clapped, not fully understanding, but sensing a joy as pure as a baby's first laugh. Ikenna stood with her help. They embraced right there, in the mud, without shame, without fear. He buried his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of soap and river water, a perfume worth more than all the bottles he once collected. Baba Ao, hidden behind a tree, watched with wet eyes. The old man clutched his chest, feeling his heartbeat as if it might leap from his mouth. He knew that this was the end of a long journey full of falls and stones. In that embrace, the old man didn't just see a son, he saw a man reborn in mud, purified in silence, who found value not in inheritance but in sharing a life. When they stepped back, they saw the grandmother smiling, her hands joined as if holding a prayer ready to fly. In the background, an old drum started to beat softly, like a heart, celebrating. Slowly, the village began to sing, improvising verses about love, mud, and courage. There was no banquet hall, no champagne, no flowery speeches. There was only truth, earth, sweat, and a ring made from the humblest metal but with the most eternal shine. That day, the entire village witnessed not just a marriage proposal, but the birth of a new man, a story to be told for generations. On warm nights around the fire, Ikenna looked at Ngiozi, squeezed her hand tightly, And in that look, without needing any words, he promised, "I will no longer hide behind surnames or high walls. I will live by your side, in the mud, in the rain, in the sun, in life." And the village, in respectful silence, understood that there is no greater wealth than loving without fear of kneeling, that whoever learns to bow before love stands taller than the whole world. The sun set slowly, dyeing the sky a deep red, as if it wanted to store in every cloud the memory of a day no one in the village would ever forget. The earth still bore the marks of feet that gathered to witness the birth of a new love. The voices, once loud with song, turned into gentle murmurs, almost like prayers. At the edge of the small mud house, Baba Ayo approached slowly, leaning on a staff he had carved himself when he chose to abandon his wealth. The old man breathed deeply, his eyes misty but steady. In each step, he carried not just the weight of the years, but the memory of sleepless nights, of knees bent on the ground begging God not to let his son die rich in possessions, but poor in soul. In the yard, Ikenna and Njosi spoke in silence, exchanging glances that said more than any word. Seeing the old man approach, Ikenna jumped to his feet, his heart beating like a drum under a full moon. Baba Ayo stopped before him, his face stern on the outside, but a sea of emotion raging within. With a slow gesture, he took from his pocket an old worn envelope. He handed it to Ikenna with a trembling hand. The son looked confused and opened it slowly. Inside was the deed to all the lands, the plantations, the rights to the farms that once sustained his empty luxury. Silence fell over the yard like a blanket. "I don't give you this as an inheritance," said Baba Ayo, his voice deep, deliberate, each word as heavy as a millstone. "I give it to you as trust. A man who kneels in the mud to ask for a woman deserves to build a true home. I waited a lifetime to see your knees touch the right ground." Tears ran freely down Ikenna's face. He tried to speak, but no words came. The old man continued, his eyes fixed on his sons. "These lands mean nothing if they are not used to plant character, if they don't shelter those in need, if they don't support those who work. I saw your rebirth, and no gold in the world can pay for what I saw." Ngozi stepped closer and held Ikenna's hand. The young man looked at her, then at his father, and with a deep sigh, let the envelope fall to the ground. He bent down, carefully took the old man's hands. "I don't want these lands to hide behind tall walls," he murmured. "I want them to build a home, to open doors for those who have none. I want to use this land to build a workshop for her, for the women who wash, who sew, who create dreams in the silence of the night." The old man closed his eyes, a thick tear sliding slowly down his wrinkled skin. That was the harvest he had waited for all his life. Not corn, not cotton, the harvest of a true man. Behind them, neighbors began to gather, one by one, as if entering a church, in silence. Each face showed respect, admiration, surprise. The factory foreman appeared, scratched his head, and bowed his eyes in reverence. And Josie's grandmother, sitting on an old bench, cried quietly, murmuring thanks. There, on that simple ground, the whole village understood that wealth is not measured by the fences that divide, but by the embrace that unites. It's not the high roof that makes a house grand, but the firm ground built with sweat, truth, and faith. That night, Baba Ayo returned to the old house he once called a palace. But now, the walls no longer carried the weight of pride. The silence was no longer of loneliness but of peace. Upon entering, he looked at an old portrait of his wife and, in a low voice, murmured, he came back, not just home, but to himself. He sat on the wooden bench, the same one where he once knelt to pray. He leaned his head against the wall, his tearful eyes staring at the ceiling. His last thought danced in his mind like an ancient prayer. A man is measured by the ground he stands on, not by the roof he shows off. Outside, Ikenna and Ngozi walked hand in hand. The simple ring shone faintly under the moonlight, but inside it held an entire universe of promises. The young man looked at the village, at the children running, at the elders murmuring blessings. For the first time, he felt his heart light, free. And in that instant, the village, the night, the stars, everything seemed to unite in a single silent hymn of hope. Because when a man understands the value of the ground, the sky becomes just. A detailed. Destiny may delay, but it never fails the just. And there, under the African sky, a new chapter was born, woven with sweat, patched with humility, stitched with love. And so, this story would spread from mouth to mouth, ride on the winds, live in hearts forever.